It's always fun to sit in a room and talk about visas for hours and hours. Look, this is my job and I love it. So I could go on forever. Our topic today is "Oh Canada." Now that's a bit of a joke because those are the first two words of the Canadian national anthem, which is also called "Oh Canada." So why are we talking about Canada? One of the big themes in immigration is opportunity. And I always say that doors open and doors close. I worked extensively in the United States immigration system, and we also work in the Canadian immigration system. And each of those countries has had immigration waves that go up and down. So one of the topics of conversation in the previous panel was how the EB-5 investment program is changing. And it's changing in ways that make it more expensive, perhaps make it more reliable. But it did change. And the Canadian investment system is the same. Some of you may remember that there used to be a Canadian investment program where you invested approximately 800,000 Canadian dollars, and you got permanent residency based on that. And then eventually that program closed. And they closed it for several years. That program still exists in one province, and that's Quebec. We'll talk about that. Every other program in every other province is not like that. And the big parameters that we're looking at for Canada are passive investment programs versus active investment programs. And that's fundamental to understand. A passive investment program, you're talking about the Quebec program, which means you invest, you wait, you get permanent residency, and that's it. So if you qualify based on the requirements of the Quebec program, that's great. We'll see what those requirements are. They are not for everybody, okay? If they were for everybody, that would be the only topic of conversation today. But because they're not for everybody, we have to look at other programs. And the other programs all have one thing in common. They are investment programs based on active investments. That means that it has to be a for-profit operating business. Now, there's a ton of business owners in this room right now, a lot of business talent. And you know that that can be anything. But it is a for-profit business that requires activity in order to qualify. And we'll get into the details. So let me give you the first slide. That's a little bit about us. We've won many awards for our work. I think we deserve it. We do very, very good work, and I'm very proud of that. We've been recognized many times as among the top 25 EB-5 attorneys in the United States, and we've certainly worked in the Canadian system with equal success. We have offices in Washington, Toronto, Delhi, and Houston, Texas. So why Canada? I said earlier, doors open and doors closed. The Canadian immigration system was modernized recently, and the modernization essentially was geared towards making it easier for immigrants to enter Canada because Canada is growing as a country and as an economy, and Canada needs both skilled and unskilled workers. It's as simple as that. It helps the country grow. So the thresholds are approximately 350,000 new workers in technology. Not only in technology, in other businesses and other trades. Even some non-skilled trades are available if you qualify. The main program is called the Express Entry Program. So how many of you have heard of this program? Okay. How many of you have been successful at navigating this program? Not that many. Why? It's not easy. If it was, again, there would be only one topic of conversation in this room, and it would be, how do I qualify for Express Entry? It doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, the Express Entry program was not intended to be for everybody. It was intended to be for the immigrants that most qualify in Canada's vision for immigration to Canada. And that basically boils down to skilled professionals who are young, have roots or connections to Canada through family members in Canada, and who have very, very strong language skills. possibly a job offer. So that limits the number of people that can access the Canadian immigration system through that program. But nevertheless, it is fundamental to understand that it is there, and it really is the point of entry, at, let's say, the last point of entry, okay? So it operates at what level? Well, in Canada, like the United States, we have provinces that run their own jurisdiction, and we have the federal government, which runs the federal jurisdiction. Unlike the United States, Canada has divided jurisdiction between the federal government and the provinces in relation to immigration. In the United States, there is only one show in town. It's called the U.S. Immigration Service. It's run by the executive part of the government called the president and his appointees. And there is no state-level immigration law in the United States. Totally opposite in Canada. In Canada, I would argue that the provincial level immigration law is actually more important than this federal level immigration law. Because while the Express Entry program sets the benchmark, the actual points of entry, the doors that are open for you, are much more accessible through the provincial programs. So Canada has how many provinces? I'm going to test your Canadian geography here. 10 provinces. I'm not going to ask you to name them. There's always one that everybody forgets. It's called Prince Edward Island. It's a little island just on top of Nova Scotia. Very nice place. Has anybody here read Anne of Green Gables? Oh, it's a great book. It's a lovely book about a little girl growing up in Prince Edward Island. I'm getting nostalgic. So look, 10 provinces. Well, what happens? When you give 10 provinces the authority to make laws about immigration, you get 10 programs. But it's not just 10 programs, because each of those provinces has several programs. So you have a huge diversity in rules and opportunities that is one of the impediments for foreign investors to navigate the Canadian system. Okay, so just be aware of that, because that means that getting good advice becomes even more important, especially at the beginning. PNP. It's part of the permanent residency system of Canada, and it stands for Provincial Nominee Program. This is what I call one of the doors for entry into Canadian immigration. It is at the provincial level, and basically the idea is the following. If you qualify for a Canadian provincial program, you will get enough points to then qualify for the federal Express Entry program. So if you were short on your CRS points when you submitted Express Entry, by going through a provincial nominee program, you will become eligible because you will get the requisite number of points to then qualify for Express Entry. That's the basic idea, okay? Now, the provincial programs are for workers, people that are skilled workers with job offers. They are for students. Sometimes in provinces like British Columbia, if you complete, I'm going to give you an example, a PhD, a doctoral degree in an academic field in such as science, technology, engineering, and math, you may be able to qualify for permanent residency in the province of Ontario just because you got that degree. Because you have skilled knowledge that is rare. PhD level knowledge, doctoral level knowledge in an area which is in demand, okay? So there are many different provincial nominee programs. I'm going to talk about investor programs. So why do I like investor programs? They have one thing in common. If the family has sufficient wherewithal to make the investment, they can sort of control their immigration hit. It's one of the few programs in the world where you are not entirely dependent on the Ministry of Labor or entirely dependent on a regulator to make the decisions for you. These programs tend to have relatively transparent rules, relatively transparent requirements. They are not for everybody. They're not intended to be for everybody. They're intended to be for investors. But if you qualify, then you can run your own immigration history in a certain sense, which is really an advantage in a process that is inherently uncertain. So you're looking for points of entry, doors, and you're looking for points of stability, a home base to let you know that the landing will be okay on the other side of that door. So the provincial nominee programs, this is where we really get into the detail of the variety of programs. So the province of Ontario has certain requirements. The province of British Columbia has other requirements. The province of Manitoba has other requirements. Let me give you an example. Ontario, Canada's most populous province, home to the Toronto Blue Jays, and of course the city of Toronto, which is Canada's most populous city. It's really economic engine, okay? Not as big as Mumbai, because few cities in the world are as big as Mumbai. But it is Canada's economic engine, and that means that the investment requirements in Ontario are higher than everywhere else. Why? Because they can. Because they can require more, because they want to make sure that the people that come to live in Canada's most populous and most expensive location have the wherewithal to survive economically and thrive. So, what are they looking at? You're looking at a minimum $800,000 net assets test, right? And then you're looking at investing $600,000 in any business and creating 2 jobs for Canadian workers with either permanent residency or Canadian citizenship. So that's very nice, it's attractive. It's not the only program they have. Why? Because they want to attract investment outside of Toronto. So outside of Toronto, the investment requirements are lower. It's $200,000 in any business and 1 job for a permanent resident or a Canadian citizen. Well, that's a very big drop. It's 1/3 of the price. It's very attractive. And then, lastly, they have 1 more program. If you invest in a technology company in Toronto, the investment requirements are, again, $200,000 and 1 job. Why? Because the province of Ontario wants to increase investment in the technology sector. So this is an example of some of the investment thresholds, but also of the diversity that you see in the Canadian immigration landscape. The investment thresholds, for example, in British Columbia are lower. Why? Because it's cheaper to do business in the province of British Columbia than it is in Ontario, in Toronto. Not in the other parts of Ontario. It's a vast province and a beautiful province, right? But it is cheaper. Now, I am going to cede my time. I think I've used up my speaking time and open the floor to questions, I hope.
You've got like a minute more.
Sorry?
1 minute more.
1 minute more.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Does the ability to invest in a province later decide that you can only reside in that province? Or like if you invest in British Columbia, you can go later live in a different province?
You could live in a different province, although Ontario, for example, British Columbia, they look for you to live in the province. The one difference is the Quebec investment program that I mentioned earlier. The Quebec investment program is a straight residency program, so you arrive into Quebec with residency. There is a requirement that you have to have intention to reside in Quebec. Residency in Quebec is, let's say, marked by one feature, which is you have to know the French language. It is very difficult to do business in Quebec without knowing the French language. So many foreign investors, eventually, over the course of a year or maybe less, eventually they will move to other parts of Canada, and that's okay. Canada has something called the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and you're allowed to move anywhere in the country. That's your prerogative, and you can't be restricted to one province. I think we're out of time. I'm going to take the question after the seminar because I think we're out of time. But thank you all for your patience, and I hope it was informative.